The establishment of Shari'a. The mullahs used stealth and intrigue to seize complete power in various government offices. This also gained them many followers. Then they steered their people to raise their voice in favor of Shari'a's establishment in every place, so everything could be ruled according to the Islamic principles. To turn around the country's culture and make it theocratic, the mullahs elevated religious leadership above everything else, so nobody had the right to speak out against their words and decisions. Eventually, they established Shari'a and began to terrify people with implementing slashing and death sentences in streets and squares. People were gripped with fear. Even leftists, who did not believe in any religion, started to bow down to the mullahs and act religious because of the unbearable persecutions. One of my old friends who held a high position in a significant government office told me that one day that he saw Mr. Hassan Tabari, a renowned Iranian communist leader, praying the Islamic daily prayer in a famous prison in Tehran. When the bubble of Islamic holy deception or taqiyya burst, many of our fellow citizens discovered that it was too late to fight the mullahs or stay away from them. People suddenly discovered that the path of vicious radicalism was set wider than any other way. They had to decide whether to side with the mullahs and live, or stay away and be deprived of everything or die. The fear of destruction overshadowed everyone. Not many dared to take a look at their situation and ask themselves how and in what way their decisions would shape their and their country's future life. They were not able to think strategically, but rather took refuge under the unethical wings of the mullahs and made the destruction of Iran their daily agenda. Many pro-democratic Iranians broke down morally and gave up courage because of the mullahs' ferocious use of terror. Some were gradually absorbed into the regime to avoid social and political deprivations. Furthermore, they started to say that they were wrong about the mullahs and had now found truth. Instead, they were working with them to uproot the remnants of Western culture in Iran. They themselves started to preach what they had once called a foolish doctrine, blaming supporters of democracy with words like Zionist, Western agent, etc., torturing us emotionally. Things changed shockingly for the worse. Even many of my friends who were once victims of dictatorship and loyal advocates of freedom joined the mullahs and functioned as the hands and legs of Islamic dictatorship, shooting their zeal for freedom in the foot. Some of these so-called champions of freedom undertook the role of spying for the mullahs, and others became persecutors of freedom fighters in prison. One of my humble followers was appointed as the head of the prison, viciously persecuting and torturing opponents. Many others also were enthralled by superstitious Islamic commands, which encouraged them to follow the mullahs blindly as Muhammad the Prophet of Islam had commanded. Striving in the path of Allah is incumbent on you, along with every ruler, whether he is pious or impious. Since the Ayatollah Khomeini was related to Muhammad genealogically, nobody could say or even imagine that he had an impiety in his life. The only choice was to follow him blindly. So the quality of leadership was not an issue for many people anymore, but what Islam said and conditions dictated. Many of our young people who were once shouting for democracy in the streets of Iran and were ready to give their lives for it were now employed to impose the mullahs' authoritarianism over their nation at every level of life. Some were also encouraged to join Muslim militias in Lebanon and Palestine to fight against Israel. The ground was progressively prepared, so everybody felt obligated forcefully to fight the mullahs' opponents or otherwise face persecution. After the mullahs seized power, they also seized all pro-monarchists and Western businesses and forced the expatriates out. The country became disconnected from the outside world, although it was still dependent upon foreign products on many levels. It fell into a great economic recession. The economic depression also made many people needy and more vulnerable to the mullahs' influence. The mullahs started to blame the West, Israel, and the Democratic Front for the country's shortages. Nearly every day in the cities, the mullahs gathered their chanting followers in the streets to blame America and Israel for the problems of the country and show the opposition that they had the people's support. People in government offices, schools, and universities who received salaries from the government were forced to join the street propaganda meetings. The mullahs turned schools, universities, hospitals, and all public places into religious political centers. They Islamized every aspect of life. Their morality was low wherever they stepped foot because the words of the Quran says that the righteous followers of Allah had to act harshly. Fear shadowed the public. Close relatives and friends whispered in each other's ears, Devar mush darad, mush gush darad. which means the wall has a mouse. The mouse has ears. In other words, watch your tongue. Don't even trust your family members, since subtle deceptions are hard to distinguish. We therefore were no longer able to speak about our rights to anyone except to whisper in the ears of those few friends who still had secret courage and desired the rule of the mullahs to fade away. On the cultural front, life went downhill and thousands of younger people left their heritage and were absorbed into the Revolutionary Guard Sepa and to the correcting religious guard Basijis. These were established to Islamize the country and make sure that everybody lived according to Islamic principles. What was envisioned before the revolution as prosperity and creativity now became a lifestyle for many to persecute fellow citizens. These younger religious guards were led by the mullahs to torture and kill people in public places. They wanted to terrify people and extinguish any desire for opposition, thus gaining more power. The mullahs used economic downturn, unemployment, and poverty as a means to gain power and rule endlessly. Under the garment of morality, they did whatever they could in order to justify their violence in the name of Islamic rule and establish their despotism. People who cared for their culture and country started to think that their best days were left in the past, the kingdom of the Shah, but it was too late. The mullahs also used the widespread and traditional choice slogans of anti-Semitism as a strong weapon for misleading the masses. They wanted to establish themselves as the legitimate Islamic rulers who have authority from Allah to destroy Israel. Any opposition was marked with the demonized words of Jew or American and eventually crushed. The mullahs hated a Western-style freedom and patiently waited with their tyrannical principles for years until they could enslave us. Because of fear, people had to be ready to sing the song of Down with America and Israel any time the mullahs wanted protests in the streets. If a business did not close for protest, then the owner could be blamed with the words Zionist or Western spy. The mullahs created an atmosphere where everybody was pro-mullah, anti-America, and anti-Israel. The mullahs left us only two options: to rescue ourselves from their humiliations, discrimination, and attacks, or to surrender ourselves to their tyrannical leadership and join others in torturing opponents and our nation. A few opponents who struggled to stomach such an allegiance chose to be humiliated rather than humiliating others, but many joined the mullahs. It was a painful experience for me to see to what extent the courage of my democratically minded fellow citizens failed them and fell short of preserving their nation's rights and prestige. Worse yet, they who once showed intelligence and cried for freedom now chose to cast their votes for an oppressive regime and surrendered their birthright of freedom for their children and grandchildren in exchange for the mullah's favor. One of my followers was one of my persecutors when I was later taken to prison. Many others, like him, saw the mullah's bloodiest commands as legitimate and called their actions righteousness. Because of fear, people started to stay away from opponents of the regime. They did not want to risk their families. Under the authoritarian and self-centered Islamic government, our society's moral character diminished, and some got paid for persecuting others, causing people to forget that they needed to uphold and take care of each other. Because of this, our beautiful country fell into the hands of a power-thirsty sect which saw every other thing as secondary, including national coherence. The mullahs were living their best days. These religious tyrants followed the humiliating philosophy of Islam and made savvy use of proxy gangsters, criminals, and terrorists to handcuff people and push them further and further behind, truly impacting the country negatively for generations to come. The media also fell into the hands of the mullahs. They stopped reporting anything irrelevant to the mullahs and censored every idea that was contrary to their way of thinking. They were used as the most influential channels for authorizing Sharia to dominate every area of life, allowing things which were once a disdain to Iranian culture. They loudly and proudly announced the bloodthirsty culture of Muhammad superior over Iranian culture. They wanted to eradicate national identity and dress with hostile Meccan culture. Sometimes they spoke in favor of Iranian identity, but such statements were only for public consumption. Blind obedience became the channel for the Ayatollah Khomeini to claim to be ruling in Muhammad's place. People believed him and forgot the pride of our nation that sheltered tolerance and protected the rights of everybody, no matter what race, religion, or color. They sadly poured their Persian identity under the feet of the Ayatollah and the mullahs, and offered up our beautiful country as a nest to terrorism. Now we hear and read that thousands of the children of those blinded fellows in Iran are protesting for freedom in the streets, and many get slaughtered by tyrannical mullahs every year. They bullied, humiliated, and destroyed our lives without thinking that the dictator mullahs would also destroy their own children in the future. I was often bullied and mocked by younger religious guards in the streets. I witnessed and experienced how these younger followers of the mullahs shouted catcalls and curses in the streets after humiliating us and fell over one another to cheer their victory. The most humiliating part was that some of these younger fellows were my own relatives. It is so sad to see that the children of the revolutionaries are suffering now from a regime to which their parents dedicated their lives. Before the revolution, we could not imagine that the day would come to our country when we would be humiliated by those who were claiming to be pro-democracy. The mullahs fought with us, claiming they wanted to end authoritarianism in Iran forever. However, their own regime became more despotic and unethical than the Shah's and any other regime since the dominance of Islam in Iran. We were shocked, confused, and frustrated. We felt crushed under the mullah's subtle deceptions or Islamic taqiyya. Once we had strived for the Iranian dream, but then surrendered to despair and destruction. The pressures people faced were so great, and they stopped listening to our cries. The hostility of the mullahs towards Western investors led the country into economic crisis, slowing down manufacturing activity, causing job losses, escalating gas prices, and causing food shortages. People struggled just to live and had nothing left in them to care about the mullahs' destructive plans. The mullahs took over big businesses and made them governmental. They did not listen to experts, but appointed people at the top of the organization who did not have any organizational skills. Experts who did not agree with them were sacked and forced to leave the country. Blind obedience and allegiance surpassed the quality of work and life. As a result, the economy failed and the distribution of everything became subject to coupons. People had to wait hours and days in lines in order to get rice, eggs, and their other daily needs. The mullahs said that they would rather die in hunger than have a relationship with the West. They wished to seize the wealth of the West rather than growing wealth through a friendly relationship with them. Unemployment increased. The nation lost its purchasing power and started to suffer through all aspects of life. Poverty and struggle to find food changed people's attitudes. Corruption started to soar and overshadow almost every citizen. Almost everyone became active in taking Iran to new depths of moral collapse. None of these moral failures mattered to the mullahs. Instead, they defended their actions with the relevant Quranic and Islamic references, calling the rule social justice and compassion, and labeling others as Israeli or American agents. Under repression and fear, many of our relatives were unconsciously turned into spies for the mullahs. Since the problems of a person in Islam are also counted the problems of his family or community, every family or community was compelled to watch the behaviors of others in order to avoid problems as much as they could. If your parents or community leaders doubted your behavior, they would immediately warn you or call a religious guard if you ignored their warnings and continued your opposition. Because of fear, friends betrayed friends, handing them over to the mullah's persecuting guards. Many were imprisoned, tortured, given lifetime imprisonment, and slaughtered. Others were forced into drug addiction to destroy their zeal for freedom and discourage other youth from supporting opposition. It had only seemed like yesterday that our dictator king was replaced by a peace-loving mullah, the Ayatollah Khomeini, with a promise of freedom and prosperity. Our backbones were broken, as Iranians say, and we were left paralyzed in every aspect. We were angry at ourselves for our ignorance and our failure at having a sound vision for the future of our country. The mullah's very clever deception impaired our vision and plans and made us unable to anticipate our future with them. The mullahs were a minority before the revolution. We were not aware that they had no option but to wait with patience and guile. They knew that Islamic dominance would not take place with sincerity and openness. They even endured the relatively secularist approach of the interim government in the first year after the revolution, as secularism is contrary to Islam's harsh political philosophy, and waited for the right time to act. They sought for the right moment when hunting their prey. They waited and eventually succeeded. They did not lose their temper even when Dr. Bani Sadr, known as pro-Western by the mullahs, won the presidential election with 80% of the people's vote a year after the revolution. They knew that this was a great victory for pro-democratic Iranians. They knew that they needed time to confuse people and bring their very subtle and tactical maneuver into work in order to confuse people and redirect the revolution from its main purpose. They did so by chasing three crucial tactics patiently. First, they challenged people and said that if they were true Muslims, they needed to follow in the footsteps of Muhammad and his so-called rightly guided successors in order to gain the favor of Allah. Leadership in Islam has an incredible appeal with Muslims who are greatly dependent on Islam and desire to trust their so-called holy leaders in order to reserve a righteous life that secures them from the punishment of Allah in the afterlife. For this, Muslims need to believe in the sovereign rights of those who rule in Muhammad's place. Muhammad and his successors had sovereign rights over people and everything. The Ayatollah Khomeini also needed to establish such a right if Iranian Muslims wanted to live with Islam and for Allah. People called themselves Muslims, but until then, they had never been publicly challenged by a leader that they were not living an Islamic life, since they were not following and imitating a religious leader. They were told it was time for them to take their faith in Islam seriously. With this challenge, the mullahs brainwashed us first and then took the idea to the parliament as a bill, passed it as law, and therefore established a sovereign right for the Ayatollah Khomeini legally as the supreme leader. This crafty approach worked among our fellow Muslims and chained us to the absolute dictatorship of Khomeini and his successors to the end. Now, nobody had any right to challenge his decisions, and nothing could be legitimate without his approval. Once I said in a public talk, Iran will not have freedom if we do not support good ideas and creativity but criticize static ideas. We need to be able to criticize everything and everybody, even our leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, because everybody can be wrong or make a mistake. This was used as a reason for my death sentence, since mullahs believe that the Ayatollah Khomeini could never be wrong. The president, Bani Sadr, had met with some of the mullahs and expressed his concern that the absolute right of a leader is the complete loss of freedom. He, however, was not able to fight against the very identity of Islam in the presence of a majority of Muslims, as this would have cost him his life and position. The bill was finally passed and yoked all Iranians to the power of the Ayatollah Khomeini. The mullah's second approach was to denigrate the plans of the democratic groups and characterize them as non-Islamic agents of the West, since they were using the word democracy, which was a construct of the West. They succeeded in this also, since the general mindset was already prepared against the West by the revolutionaries. The mullahs said that Iran did not need a Western-style democracy, but an Islamic-style democracy, in which people are only free to do what Islam commands. Freedom is for following Muhammad, but not for rejecting him. Their third approach was to put the sovereign right of the Ayatollah Khomeini into practice and deal with opposition according to the Shari'a, the law of Islam. It was after this that any opposition to the mullahs turned into an uphill battle and failure. It was at this point that President Bani Sadr was attacked by rockets. His presidency collapsed, and he had to run for his life. Of course, a fourth component was needed for the mullahs to protect them nationally and fulfill their mission internationally. The two branches of the Iranian version of Hezbollah, Sepah and Basijis, were created so that these armies could rescue them from any possible coup, similar to what happened in 1953 AD to the revolutionary Prime Minister of Iran, Dr. Mossadegh, and the coup that returned the Shah to power again. Because of this, the mullahs closely watched the officers of the General Army who were trained by the Shah and promoted only those officers who showed loyalty to the mullahs. The mullahs' second goal in establishing Hezbollah was to invade countries around Iran, destroying the rights of Western secularism and preparing Muslim nations to capture Israel. They wanted a Middle East without Israel and Western influence. In the meantime, the mullahs started to invest huge amounts of the country's wealth in Lebanon and Syria. They wanted to strengthen the Hezbollah to gain power in Lebanon and establish Iran as the number one enemy to Israel in the region. They began to employ everybody who came to them, especially younger people, to establish a stronger Hezbollah, or the Army of Allah, in Lebanon. All these elements show that the mullahs were the best organized group who had a plan to dominate Iran rapidly, even though they were in the minority. We were all shocked at how these minority mullahs captured the country in a short time after the revolution and were able to silence the majority.